Matt, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. 6,000 miles away, in a different continent, in the land of the rising sun, also known as the land of the samurai, the finest rugby players from the top 20 countries are competing for the highest prize in world rugby. You might wonder what that's got to do with me, a psychiatrist, coming to talk to a bunch of people involved in property development. Well, the reality is, if we think about those teams, talent-wise, there's probably 4 or 5 that are going to be contenders to win that trophy. What is it that will mark them apart? What is it that will allow that one team to lift the William Webb Ellis Trophy? It's one thing, and it's resilience, because technically, like all of you in the room, people are very good, very well trained, physically fit, etc. But how we perform under pressure is key. So for the last 10 years, colleagues and I, running a team at Cognacity, have been training people through workshops and coaching in how to perform effectively under pressure. And the interesting thing is that although we work with a lot of blue chip companies, individuals themselves benefit just as much. We've taken lessons from our elite sport clients because performance psychology doesn't just apply to the performance world. And what I'm going to do this afternoon in 20 or 25 minutes is take you through our model in relatively fast time, but hopefully sowing a seed in all of you to think about one, maybe 2 things you can think about in terms of your own thinking styles and behaviours that will make you more resilient. Many of you will be familiar with some of the concepts we're talking about, but a little bit like how committed we are to looking after our health, when we're busy, these things tend to fall off our to-do lists. So first of all, pressure and stress. There are lots of different sources in life of pressure and stress, but interestingly, there's only one of these on the screen that's subject to any kind of influence from ourselves, and that's the one bottom right, because we can't control work, we can't control life events. Most of us aren't brilliant at marshalling the way in which we put work in front of ourselves. But our internal, our psychological, our mental response to pressure and stress is very much up for grabs. We mustn't give stress a bad name, because we do need a degree of stress in order to perform. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to the audience. Where's the stress in this picture?
He looks hungry, and he looks terrified.
Great, that's really good. Most people that get asked this only point at the zebra and say the zebra's under pressure, but in fact both of these creatures are. If the lioness doesn't kill the zebra, there's no lunch for the lioness and the lioness's pride or family. So stress, we need to understand, is an interaction between a stressor and a stressee. And just like the animal world, we respond in the same way. As soon as we're put under pressure, we have this deeply ingrained neurobiological response. The limbic system releases cortisol, releases adrenaline, and it causes our attention to be narrowed down on our body to get ready for the fight or flight response, which all of you have heard about in school and beyond. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if we look at the stresses that we're involved in on a day-to-day basis, how many of these are actually life-threatening, and how many of these are solved by that fight or flight response? Interestingly, for those of you that run businesses, and Penny, I'm sure this is something you're familiar with, number 2 on the list is that feeling undervalued at work is more stressful than many of the work-related tasks we face. So for those of you that run businesses, just have a think about, how often do I appreciate work that's being done? How often do I appreciate my team? Because if you get better at that, you're going to reduce the stress these people are under. Our fight-flight response is great when we're under physical danger. In the olden days, I used to now pull out a knife and go at someone to just trigger the stress response, but all those ethic committees at UCL said you can't possibly do that anymore. So we don't do that. But if I did do that, you would instantaneously react by getting ready to fight me or to run away. So the physical threat can be overcome. Now, if we look at these stressors, how many are a physical threat? None, not in the short term. How many of these are solved by physical action? Well, we joke about it, but occasionally at work, someone blows their top and they lose it, and they shout at someone or worse. Now, that's not a functional response, but that's our stress response, fight-flight response kicking in. More commonly, we see people get into an avoidance cycle, fight, flight. Avoidance, not going into work, taking a duvet day, not feeling great. So in fact, our stress response can come into play in the modern era. But the big problem is this. All of those stressors I showed you on the board are not short-term, they don't go away. Our to-do lists never evaporate. I never get to the end of a week, a month, a year, and my to-do list is clear. It just builds and builds and builds, and we have to prioritise. And the problem is that if we keep operating under those chronic pressures, then eventually something must give. So here's the thing about stress. We all need some stress to function. So if I take, any of you who've got teenage kids, I've got a couple of teenage daughters, and in their run-up to GCSEs and A-levels, we want them to be functioning here, so they're under pressure, they're under stress, but their performance is high. It needs to be sustainable. There may be the odd wobble, they might get a bit knackered, they might get a bit emotional now and again, but they get through it. Now the interesting thing is, days after they finish their exams, and we take the pressure away, look what happens to performance. They become, and they're not mentally ill or physically unwell, couch dwelling, TV watching, social media surfing, monosyllabic refusers of doing any domestic work. Correct. And that's simply because we've taken pressure off. So we need some pressure. We mustn't give pressure a bad name. Here's the problem. Most of us have been in that situation where we've got a lot on and we've put our heads down and we've said, I'm just going to work my way through this. We have this intended performance curve where we think if we just keep going, we'll be able to get through it, we'll be able to catch up, I'll have a rest at the weekend, or there's a holiday coming up. How many of you have had that experience where you work so hard in anticipation of a holiday that the first 2 or 3 days you're just exhausted and don't enjoy it? Okay, the balance isn't there. So if we just overwork, we end up in this scenario here, which psychologists sometimes call burnout. And interestingly, GPs will tell you that of chronic conditions they treat, 2/3 have an underlying chronic stress causation. So you may see a number of different symptoms, a number of different mild symptoms in the course of your working when you're particularly pressured. The common ones would be tension in the head and neck because you've been working too hard, maybe some GI problems, maybe not sleeping so well. The difference between the animal kingdom and the humans is that the stress that we carry in the modern era is psychological. And I'm going to prove this by doing a little experiment. In a second, I'm going to show a video. Watch it very carefully and just be aware of any changes in your bodies. Play it once more. I don't wear those cut-down jeans anymore. Hands up if, like me, you don't particularly like heights. Okay, I'm going to start. First person put his hands up. What did you notice in your body when I played that video? Your heart rate went up. Hands up if your heart rate went up. Hands down. Hands up if anyone felt something different. Behind that gentleman. So you show me a sort of lurching movement. You felt something in your gut that was like a movement or something unpleasant. Hands up if you got that. Anything different?
Tension when he jumped over the gap.
Holding your breath? Feeling it physically in your body. Okay, so let's complete the experiment. Everyone sit up straight for me. Just wiggle your bums in the seats and stamp your feet on the floor. We know Matt well enough, health and safety. We wouldn't come to somewhere that wasn't safe and secure, but you're all sat in a non-threatening environment, in a safe seat. I've played you a video, and for many of you, I've triggered your stress response. So that's how sensitive this system is, which is a good thing if we know how to manage it. The challenge we've got is this. For most of us that work too hard, we end up in this burnout or languishing phase. And unless we do something about it, the danger is that we might slip down here. 1 in 6.5 people in the workplace are suffering from a diagnosable mental disorder, many of them undiagnosed. So what is it that we can do either here, or even if we're well, or even if we're really flourishing, to be able to maintain our levels of health or improvement? In general terms, we call this psychological resources, positive psychology, and this is the bread and butter of resilience and resilience training. So let's take a look at that. In the world of elite sport, people stand out because they are supremely fit, supremely competent, and there are a number of people that really are at the very top of their game, and I do hope, for all the right reasons, Owen Farrell might be one of those over the next 5 weeks. But interestingly, there's only one major difference between the people on this screen and the people here in the audience that makes them more resilient. And I'd be amazed if you knew what that was. So I'm going to ask you, can anyone tell me what they think the main difference between our elite athletes and ourselves is in terms of resilience? Training. So training in this context, these people train to what they do. In the work context, it's about how much work we do, how much preparation we put in. So arguably they're quite similar. It's just in a different domain. So it's not training. Determination. I'd like to think that in this room there are some very, very, very determined people. We heard Penny talk earlier, and you could hear the kind of the ambition of that 20-something-year-old to pull off these incredible deals. So determination is not the difference.
Rest. Is it rest?
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause. I've been giving this talk for about 4 or 5 years, and it's very rare that someone gets it. The difference is rest. These people have rest and recovery hardwired into their schedules in a way that we don't. We tend to work flat out and then recover. In average day, in average week, in average month, these people have a very clear, wobbly line. Intense work rest, intense work rest, intense work rest. So that's number one lesson to learn. But what do we mean by resilience? The video's playing to show you some examples of people in the modern era who we would say are very resilient. People who work in military, who work in maybe emergency services, people who work in the police. But are these people born resilient? The answer is there's a very, very small type of personality combination, probably about 5 to 7% of the population that might be a little bit more resilient, but generally no. So we have to accept a few things. We can't change our environments, but we can train people to be more resilient. This is the training I was talking about earlier, and I'm giving you an overview of this now. What do we mean by resilient? There's 3 key things, and when I explain them, you'll all see how obvious they are, but actually under pressure we often forget them. Keeping stress in proportion. How many times have we been in a situation where you feel really threatened, really under pressure, and that thing you're dealing with has so much of a huge significance to you, it's almost like life or death, and yet you look at it further down the line, look at it in retrospect, and it was blown out of proportion. Secondly, directing our focus. A lot of people, when the fight-flight response kicks in, tend to be a bit headless. And the reason for that is their attention gets drawn to the threat. So the threat is the thing that we want to avoid or cope with or deal with, and then we lose sight of other things that may be important. And finally, as my learned friend here has told us, it's about recovering properly. So I'm going to now step you through our approach to improving people's resilience. And my challenge to the audience, because you're going to hear an awful lot today from an awful lot of speakers, is by the end of my talk to choose one thing that you're going to go out of here and do differently. So what are the 4 areas? The first is to do with, this all comes from the realm of cognitive and behavioural neuroscience. The first is to do with our cognitions or our thinking. How often do we stop and analyse how we've thought in pressured situations? I would argue not that often. We tend to get through pressure situations, we move on, we get to the next thing. We may feel we're learning, but how much forensic analysis have we applied to our thinking style and how helpful that was? If we start to do that, we will recognise, and I'll show you how, the common thinking errors that we all have much of the time. And under pressure, those thinking errors can get in the way. They can divert our attention, so our focus isn't so good, and they can influence our behavioural responses. If we understand those, then we can do a better job at choosing the most appropriate response under pressure. And then finally, along the lines of what we were saying earlier, how do we hardwire recovery behaviours, rest, into the busy schedules that we all have? It's very difficult, but it can be done. So think about our thinking styles. I'm going to give you an example. So Penny and I are travelling on the same train to work one day. And as you've heard and seen, Penny's a very cool, calm, collected individual. We're both going to extremely important meetings. I'm going to a big pitch. Penny's going to a meeting with a very, very high net worth client. Let's say for the sake of argument, Penny sometimes travels on trains. We know it's jets, but let's say for the sake of argument, we're on the train. And the train staggers to a halt, and there is no announcement. silence. And I start to think, knowing about my psychology, if I'm late for this meeting, the first impression I give to my client will be very negative. And in fact, because I know about psychology, first impressions are everything. If I give that negative impression, it doesn't matter how good my pitch is or my presentation, there's a danger here that we may just lose this client. If we lose that client, that's a major, major threat to my portfolio and to my bonus for this year. And then there's that young guy that joined us about 18 months ago who seems to be doing really, really good guns in his sector. And the business owners really do seem to quite like him. They're doing a lot of socialising with him. So am I personally going to be somehow in threat here? And if that happens and I don't get my bonus, we've got the third kid going into private school next year. This is going to put me under a huge amount of pressure. And if we can't keep the kids in school, well, my wife is going to think that I'm a complete failure. And if my wife thinks I'm a complete failure and we haven't had much quality time recently, well, you know, this isn't... Meanwhile, Penny gets out a book and starts reading. We're both in the same situation. We're both experiencing the same experience, but our emotional, our behavioural, our psychological responses are completely different. So A never causes C. It's because our perception of a situation, as I just demonstrated, is a lens and a filter through which everything happens. So perceptions are really crucial when we're under pressure. I don't know if you saw this in the press, but this had to be hushed up, of course, because it was, I don't know what the provocative statement that was said by the press member was, but so our human brains do things quickly and they add stories. And you've probably, all of you, seen this one, so I'm going to show it to you quickly and ask you the question, what colour's the dress? I'm going to start right at the back. White shirt just at the end of that row. What colour's the dress, sir?
To me, it's blue.
All blue, or is there a variance in it?
Variance in it.
So what do you see? Is it
Blue and black.
blue and black? Okay, I'll take blue and black. Hands up if you see this as blue and black. So that looks to me like about 2/3, maybe, yeah, of the audience. Hands down. Hands up if you see a different colour. So I'm going to ask you what you see.
White and gold.
Hands up if you see white and gold. Nice and high. On average, 15 IQ points higher than the blue blacks. All right, I made that up. So we can see a spread across the room. It doesn't matter where you're sitting, we're seeing this completely differently. So for me, from the bottom up, white, gold, white, gold. Hands up if you see different to those colours. What do you see?
I see the blue black.
You see the blue black. Anyone?
Almost leopardy black gold.
Leopardy black and gold. Come and see me afterwards. Okay, one more on the perceptions drive. So this eager-looking man sitting here in the front with the goatee is going to read out what's on the screen. What can you see?
It's Miss Golf. According to research, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place.
Actually fail. It says Eokdring to Guskich. It does not mature in what. So you did what everyone does. Your brain solves a problem. We grew up in an education system where you get rewarded for doing things quickly and doing it well and solving problems. So this is really important to note because these cognitive shortcuts that we take, whilst they're helpful, they get us through work quickly, they can cause problems and they are much more marked under pressure. So we're looking for patterns and stories. And the problem with this is that mind traps that we've got, and I described earlier, Penny and I on the train, I start to catastrophize. The mind traps are the common routes or silos that we go down in terms of our thinking styles. So I've talked about catastrophizing already. The other common ones are personalization, where you take responsibility. You believe everything is about you. It's about what you're doing. You have to do everything and get it right. Shoulds. People believe that there's a code in which life must be lived. We should work in this way. I should get my work done at this time. I should work to this standard. These people that work with me should work to these standards. Mind reading. If we could mind read, we would all be a lot wiser and wealthier than we are. How many of us have had that situation where we've said, well, I know what he or she said, but I really know what they're thinking. We do it all the time, but we can't actually mind read. And last of all, black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking, extremes, where we can't see anything but less than perfect. Very common in perfectionists. My wife used to be a corporate litigator, so this is a really healthy form of thinking. If you're reviewing a document that's got 800 pages over a weekend, you have to rule out any mistakes that are there. That rigidity, that inability to let anything go, that's really functional. How functional do you think that thinking is when my wife is negotiating with our 16-year-old daughter about what time she comes home from a party? Not in the slightest. So these thinking styles, they come around all the time. In a workshop, we would help people to recognize their patterns and do something about it. And the key thing is to be able to then recognize what your perceptual disturbances or distortions are, where your automatic thoughts take you, so you can do something about it. Because as soon as we recognize that thinking hasn't been that helpful, we can check. So what are the facts of the situation? What actually happened in that scenario where I thought I'd be late, I would lose the pitch, I would then possibly lose my job? Did that happen? No. So let's challenge it with the evidence. And that challenge can be reinforced by asking the question, was it a helpful thought at the time? Interestingly, most humans are poor at self-analysis and self-judgment. So this last part, the change, is tricky. And we would encourage people working with them to ask this question. If you get stuck, what would you advise a friend? As soon as you make it non-personal, the answer is really obvious. So that is the thinking, that is the cognitive, that's the C of CBT or CBC, changing our thinking into a more healthy approach. Lastly, in the last couple of minutes, a few words on behaviour. For most people, and I challenged you earlier to choose one thing to do differently, behaviours are the easiest thing to change because you just choose it and make it a habit. What we know from the research that we've done is that anything we can do to make our line more wobbly, more like the athletes up here, will pay back for us. So there are very kind of robust research studies that look at the benefits of various behavioural interventions. Many of these you'll be aware of already, but spending time with others is the one that often goes out of diaries. Exercise and movement, I'm afraid, is no longer negotiable. Hydration is key. If I was giving talks like this in organisations 5 years ago, there would have been very few water bottles on desks. Now they're there everywhere. 3% dehydration is the equivalent of 10% reduction in your cognitive capacity. So don't allow yourselves to get dehydrated. The roadside tests of knowing if you're dehydrated, basically are you peeing and is your wee relatively light in colour. Simple as that. Sleep is another crucial one. People argue about what the minimum amount of sleep should be. Of course, it varies from person to person. Hands up if you use your iPhone or mobile device as an alarm clock. So immediately stop doing that. The blue light that comes from most portable digital devices, the blue light inhibits the release of melatonin, which is our sleep precursor hormone. So just looking at emails for 5 minutes before you get into bed is delaying your melatonin release by 40 to 60 minutes and reducing your sleep quality. Buy an analog alarm clock, put the phone elsewhere. There are lots of things you can choose to do, but we know from the work that we've done that the way in which we can make this sustainable is to make changes small. Any of you who've joined a gym in January, gone on a detox diet, gone on a kind of life evolving or changing behaviour plan, will recognise it's not sustainable. This is the marginal gains theory that's so famous with Sir Clive Woodward, Sir David Brailsford, in the elite athlete realm. Change things a little, but keep them changed. 21 days happens to be the magic number. If you choose to do one of these challenges, do it for 21 days. 21 days will make it become, or give it a very good chance of becoming a habit, and you can hang on to that and then maybe build to something else. So that's it, our 4-point resilient plan. I hope you'll go away knowing a little bit more about thinking and how thinking styles can compromise our ability to stay focused. Also understanding that you do have the ability to choose your responses. If you're a catastrophizer or a black and white thinker, that's just a kind of learnt thinking style. You can adapt that. Speak to friends, speak to family, people you know well. See if you can identify that in each other and encourage them to look at that. And finally, if you're going to choose a behaviour to change, give it a go, small change for 21 days. Thank you very much.